I welcome you all for this session on strabismus, and it will be a wonderful, interactive and informative session. And we have got today Dr. Ankur Sinha, a prominent strabismologist and pediatric ophthalmologist, and we would like to hear from him the pearls for management of strabismus. So I welcome you, sir, and I think Rishi, I will ask Rishi, I will request Rishi to give a short introduction of Dr. Sinha before his talk.
It is indeed a privilege for us to have Dr. Ankur Sinha for a talk in our meet today. Dr. Ankur is an alumni of the prestigious RP Center for Ophthalmic Sciences. He was a clinical observer at Yale Eye Institute, USA. He has presented, he has published more than 25 publications in peer-reviewed journals and 50 free papers and posters in national and international conferences, and 5 chapters in books and more than 200 conference participation. He was awarded the best senior resident of AIIMS and also best free paper in annual conference of DOS as well as Rajasthan Ophthalmological Society. With this, I will invite Dr. Ankur for his talk.
Thank you, Dr. Rishikesh, for such a nice and elaborate introduction. I would like to thank MOS for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this. And it is nice to see all the seniors and friends here after a very long time, and hoping that we meet physically sometime. So I'll be starting with brief pearls in management of strabismus. So management of strabismus can be divided into non-surgical and surgical parts. So the primary thing is to prescribe spectacles. The spectacles are very handy in comitant strabismus. The common forms which can be managed by spectacles are accommodative esotropia, intermittent exotropia rarely, and consecutive strabismus. We can also plan to have Botox temporarily for paralytic squints and infantile esotropias. So this is a case of fully accommodative esotropia. The patient only requires is full correction of glasses to maintain binocularity and alignment both. This is a case of intermittent exotropia, minded that this patient is having a very high AC by A ratio. That is why we are able to give this patient overcorrected myopic lenses, and then we can see the alignment here. So a lot of intermittent exotropias do not have high AC by A ratio, and overcorrection of glasses does not help them. So giving glasses does not make the game over. The motive is to relax accommodation in case of accommodative esotropias and stimulate accommodation in cases of intermittent exotropias. So we have to check the fitting of glasses, like both these children are looking over the glasses and the glasses are running down their noses. So they are not the good fitting glasses we need for these children. And this child also is having a very tight glasses over the ears. So the patient is having uncomfortable wearing of the glasses. And we can also see this redness here, which is hurting this child. So what we want is a proper fitting of glasses for which, with which the patient is comfortable and continues to wear them. We can also have drugs to manage strabismus, cycloplagia like atropine and hometropine for children. We can also prescribe glasses over them to avoid blur. Cholinergics can also be used to decrease central accommodative effort in case of accommodative esotropias. Prisms can also be handy, but they can only handle very small amount of deviation, say 7 to 8 prism diopters for each eye, or we have to move for Fresnel prisms. They can also be used to control post-surgical diplopia with over and under corrections, both in comitant and incomitant strabismus. Sometimes they can be used to support for poor convergence. Now, this is a case of exotropia who is operated for right RNR, and the patient goes into consecutive esotropia. So what we do is we prescribe him prisms and wait for the drift. If the patient drifts back and aligns the eyes, till the time we elevate the diplopia. If it doesn't, then we have to plan for a resurgery in this patient. Orthoptic strizes are also very handy, but they work very well for small exos with asthenotic symptoms. Synaptophore is a very good device, but we can also make use of pencil push-ups and simple home orthoptic trainer. Now we move on to the basic principles of surgeries. So we have either a weakening or a strengthening, but mind it, both of them are misnomers because there is no true weakening and no true strengthening. All we do is we just alter the length tension curve of the muscle. Now this is the nomogram, which is showing you minimum and maximum of the recti. So if you do less than minimum, it is not going to be effective. If we go for more than maximum, then we are actually dealing with the muscle rather than the tendon, and then the results will be unpredictable. So it is always advisable to be in the range of minimum and maximum. Now, a few more points. Whenever we plan a surgery under GA, it is always advisable and good to have bilateral recessions because they can cause similar change in the globe position and similar change in the palpebral aperture. Also, recessions are reversible and there is no loss of tissue. Whenever we plan RNR, there is more effect per muscle of surgery, and large RNR can cause palpebral aperture changes, which has to be kept in mind. Now we move on to the surgical dosage. The recession is a stronger speed than resection. Medial rectus is a stronger muscle than lateral rectus. So medial rectus can give you 3 to 4 prism diopters per millimeter, while lateral rectus will give you only 2 to 3 prism diopters per millimeter. Larger deviations and younger patients tend to respond more than smaller deviations and older patients. Similarly, there are patient factors and surgeon's factors which can alter the surgical dosage which we have planned for. Then there are techniques of muscle exposure. So von Nuden is a very good approach where we give 2 radial and 1 circumferential incision, but it is good for beginners. It gives you a good exposure of anatomical landmarks, but there can be a problem of limbal bleeding. Parks is cosmetically better, but it is very important to understand that the exposure to anatomical landmarks is limited and it may be difficult for beginners. Swan can cause a lot of fibrosis. One can also utilize Prem Prakash's paralimbal incision. Now, it is very important to understand that under the block or under the GA, the eye can rotate. And Park's incision, though cosmetically better, it becomes all the more difficult for beginners. Now, these are the various procedures for weakening and strengthening of recti. We have to choose one very judiciously. Now, this is a case of partially accommodative esotropia that she still continues to have esotropia with glasses. So giving glasses is not just sufficient. So we have to plan something for her. We have to align the eyes. So we check for all the 9 gazes. There is no AV pattern, no oblique overactions. What we plan is just one muscle recession, that is right MR recession by 5 millimeters, and we align the eyes absolutely fine. Do not miss out the oblique dysfunctions. Now, both these girls are already operated in consecutive strabismus, and we can see that this girl is not showing any oblique overaction, but mind it is the primary gaze. So once we ask the patient to look into the tertiary gazes, we can clearly see that the inferior oblique overaction is there. So do not get carried away by horizontal deviation and just say that there's no oblique overaction. Often we receive such calls from younger people and general ophthalmologists. So we do a full 9 gaze evaluation. We see that there is a V pattern and inferior oblique overaction in both the eyes. So this girl undergoes bilateral LR recessions with inferior oblique recessions by 10 millimeters. And this is the post-operative photograph of the same child. So whenever we are planning inferior oblique surgeries, be careful for the anatomical landmarks. So once we have this 6 millimeter and 6 millimeter, this is the Fink's point, which is about 8 millimeters. We go 2 millimeter back, this is 10 millimeter recession. Other 2 common surgeries are Ilyton-Nankin and modified Ilyton-Nankin. Ilyton-Nankin can give you something like an anti-elevation syndrome, which can be utilized in DVDs. These are the various procedures for inferior oblique. Choose the appropriate procedure because oblique surgeries can sometimes be unpardoning. This is another case of IDS with superior oblique overactions, which are usually missed by general ophthalmologists, and they just do a kind of horizontal surgery, which is not good for this patient because A pattern is not acceptable. So what we plan here is bilateral lateral rectus recessions by 5 millimeters and PTSOs. So this is the post-op photograph of the same patient where the A pattern is collapsed and superior oblique overactions are gone. Again, choose the procedure very judiciously, whatever we are doing, because obliques can be unpardoning. If you have problems in finding out the fibers of superior oblique, then you can either use trypan blue, gentian violet, or ICG to stain them and look at them. So in the end, I would just like to say, do not jump to surgery by looking at the strabismus. The glasses can play an important role. Also, do not delay surgical intervention when it is actually required. Proper assessment is the key, and surgery, the aim is not surgery. The aim is alignment, stereoequity, and in the end, do not allow an inferiority complex in a child that is relating to personal development of the child. Thank you for your kind attention.
Yeah, good talk, Ankur. You covered the talk well in that limited time. Very well.
Thank you.
And covered many points too.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
So we have now Dr. Varsha who speaking to us on vision assessment in pre-verbal and preschool children, a very important topic which helps us in assessing the vision, which is the utmost important point.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is my screen seen? Visible?
Who will
Yes,
use-
ma'am.
My screen is visible?
Yes,
Yes,
it-
madam. It's visible. Yes.
Wonderful talk, Dr. Ankur, very informative. I would like to thank Scientific Committee, MOSCON, especially Dr. Ragini Madam, Dr. Snehal, Dr. Himalini for giving the opportunity. I'll be discussing vision assessment in pre-verbal and preschool children. Vision assessment meaning estimating maximum ability to see. Two distinct points will be visible when two separate cones are stimulated. And the standard normal fixed vision 6/6 is equal to angular separation of 1 minute at fovea. In adults, it is very simple to assess the vision on Snellen's or logMAR charts, but measuring vision in pre-verbal and preschool children requires special skill, time, patience, and special tests. Traditional vision tests for adults are based on character recognition, and they are not useful in infants because there is no patient cooperation and visual system is immature. So methods of vision testing in child depend upon child's age, abilities, knowledge, and available facilities. And one should always be aware of visual milestones of this particular age group in children. So for vision assessment, we have detection acuity test, recognition tests, and various resolution acuity tests. The Cartford drum test, which is useful in infants and preschool children, it is a detection acuity test where pendular eye movements will be elicited as the child follows the oscillating drum. When dots of with the dots, and that will be the smallest dot that evokes the pendular movement determines the visual acuity. But the disadvantage that it overestimates the vision by double or quadruple. Then the preferential looking test based on the preferring of the child to fixate on a pattern stimulus rather than a blank surface of the same brightness. And the commercially available PL cards are used in the clinics. Then the Taylor Acuity Card test, which is simple and rapid test for children up to 18 months. And the highest frequency grating, which is seen, gives a measurement of acuity. It can be converted into Snellen's notation, but again, drawback is that the tests usually does near corrects, checks the near acuity only, and it may miss myopia, and sometimes it also overestimates the vision. Then the Cardiff acuity cards, which have pictures of vanishing octotypes, and these pictures vary at particular some distance and will give you the idea about the vision. Then the opticokinetic nystagmus drum, which is traversing slowly before a normal infant's eye, will produce involuntary jerky nystagmus. And the smaller the target producing optokinetic nystagmus will give you the idea. There will be a better vision if the smallest target produces OKN. But again, disadvantage is that it cannot be graded. Then VEP is highly advanced test to determine the integrity of nerve transmission from eye to occipital lobe. It is simple non-invasive test. It records the electrical signal generated by the occipital cortex in response to visual stimulation pattern detected by the surface electrodes monitoring the occipital cortex. It records the vision in up to 6 to 6/9 at the age of 6 months. Stimuli may be pattern or unpatterned flash. The objective record of underlying visual pathway by VEP gives good idea, but it excludes organic pathology. And again, it can sometimes overestimate the vision. Sweep VEP, on the other hand, is a rapid test, produces 20 stimuli in swift fashion, projected for 0.5 seconds and completed in 10 seconds for again screening purpose. So all these tests which we have described earlier need sophisticated instruments, and many times they are not available in our clinics. So for general ophthalmologist and also for basic examination, indirect assessment of visual acuity in infants is very, very important. And simple things like brief visual history, examination of anterior and posterior segment, pupil reaction, presence of squint, nystagmus, cycloplegic refraction, blink reflex, Bruchter's test, and fixation reflex will give lot of information regarding the child's vision. The blink, the baby blinks at birth. Sorry. The baby, there's a video. The baby blinks at birth, and we can see, even if it is so close, there is a poor vision. can be just seen through this video. Then the fixation reflex is also very important, which is prerequisite for the normal visual development, and which is present at birth. And even with the light, if the child is not following the light, this simple test will also give you the idea that there is a poor vision from the fixation reflex also. So again, type of fixation, which is very, very important and must be seen by all to know the visual status. The central steady fixation means the child is fixating at fovea. There is no nystagmus, no ocular dominance, and it should be observed by both eyes open and separately. The gross eccentric fixation indicates very poor vision, less than counting figure 1 meter. Unsteady central fixation means less than 6/60. Steady central fixation, but it is not maintained, indicates that the vision is between 660 to 636. Central steady fixation, but preference of the other eye. Central steady maintained fixation, free alternation means good vision in each eye. Then simple this observing the child, that the preference of fixation in one eye over the other, that in this case like right unilateral squint, not taking fixation, suggestive amblyopia, poor vision. If there is resistance to closure of one eye, which we can do easily in our OPD, indicates poor vision in the other eye and can give a clue about the visual status. Then induced tropia test, where we can put a 10 prism base down in front of apparently fixing eye, which causes both eyes to jump up if it is a truly fixing eye with good vision. But if there is no vertical movement, that means the eye in non-fixing, the eye which is non-fixing has a poor vision, and we can diagnose low vision in infants. For 1 to 2 years, child's attention is easily distracted after 9 months. So teller acuity cards, Cardiff cards they are not very useful. So we can have these small boy candy tests, where small edible candies of 1 to 2 millimeter size can they can serve as incentives also, and they are used as visual stimuli, and ask them to pick up and eat. If it is difficult, that means the vision is less than 6/24. So, and each eye is to be tested alternately, and difference is noted. Then with ivory ball tests, ivory balls of different sizes rolled on floor, the smallest ball pick up will tell us the visual acuity. In 2 to 3 years, miniature toys tests are there. Pair of miniature toys can be used. Point tests with different size points. Dot visual acuity test, where smallest dot identified correctly on the illuminated box with the printed dots will give you some idea. In 3 to 5 years of children, principles, we can use Tumblingy, Landot-C, Sheridan letter test, etc. So these are the various least symbol. Tumblingy will give you the idea about the vision in this age group, 3 to 5 years. So to conclude, that visual acuity tests in pre-verbal children needs expensive test material. They are operator dependent, they are time consuming, did not give correct vision always, may overestimate vision, we may miss amblyopia in this test. And the purely objective tests like VEP are again available in institutional setups and not available for all. So careful observation of the child is very, very important, and it is must, and that will give you important clues about the patient's vision from the fixation pattern and response to occlusion. And before all this, one should establish a good rapport with the child. The reward for positive response must be ready in the form of chocolate. Examination should be fun for them, and several tries at different times within the child's attention span are necessary. Thank you. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think you can.
Thank you, Varsha Madam, for an excellent presentation. And I think it's good into the insight into the visual assessment in pre-verbal children. I think we will move ahead to the next talk. The next speaker is Dr. Shubhangi Bhave Madam. She is, I think she doesn't need an introduction as such. She is a pediatric ophthalmologist practicing in Nagpur since 37 years. And she has many publications in national journals. She is a recognized postgraduate teacher by Nagpur University. She was a past president of Nagpur Academy of Ophthalmology and Vidarbha Ophthalmic Society, and also a scientific committee chairman of Vidarbha Ophthalmic Society. She has been organizing chairman of Maharashtra State Conference 2 years back, which was done physically. And presently she is practicing at Drishti Eye Clinic and Squint Center. Center since 1994. With this, I'll invite Dr. Bhave Madam for her talk on acute comitant esotropia.
Good afternoon, Dr. Bhave ma'am, and I think you have introduced her so well. You cannot make out that she's practicing for 37 years because she looks young and beautiful always. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Varsha ma'am. Thank you,
Hello,
Dr.
madam.
Sikesh. And thank you for
Thank you,
this
ma'am.
wonderful session. And I won't interrupt because we want to hear Dr. Shubhangi ma'am further. I've already interrupted, but I won't hold you longer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ragini, and thanks, MOS, for allowing us to conduct this session. And thanks, Nehal. Today, I'll be talking on this topic of acute acquired concomitant esotropia. Let's say that it is characterized by a concomitant, acute onset, non-accommodative esotropia. Each term is important. There is generally associated with diplopia and visual confusion. There is a good potential for binocular vision with highly favorable surgical result. Age is generally more than 5 years, and there is no tendency for spontaneous resolution. When all these characters are present, we tend to diagnose it as acute concomitant acquired esotropia. The age of onset is late. Normally, 3 types are described. Type 1 is following artificial interruption of fusion, that is one type. This is fairly easy to diagnose. Type 2 is in concomitant esotropia of Frankeschetty type. This is accompanied with diplopia and good potential for binocular cooperation. And type 3 is in concomitant esotropia of Bilchowski's type. These patients have myopia up to 5 diopters, have uncrossed diplopia for distance and fusion for near. But the distinction between type 2 and type 3 may not be this clear-cut. And type 2 is moreover more difficult to diagnose. And concomitance in a case of esotropia does not rule out that there is no underlying neurological condition. It could still be associated with a neurological lesion. So it is very important to rule out the neurological lesion, if any, in these cases. Then one more point is more excess of near work and stress also is an important factor in development of this type of esotropia. Key points in examination: history taking as usual is important. Examination for uncorrected hyperopia, anisometropia, AC over A ratio, myopia. One has to do a detailed orthoptic checkup, Hess charting. The late age of onset and diplopia indicate absence of subduction. And neuroimaging, as I have said, is to rule out the intracranial lesions. We do not know why these exactly how these lesions could cause intracranial tumors, could cause acute concomitant esotropia, because it is not a LR palsy, which is there in concomitant, but here maybe because of the hydrocephalus or maybe because of the effect on the Virgin centers in the mesencephalon or on the brainstem or cerebellum, we develop an concomitant esotropia. It is postulated that could be because of hydrocephalus. Differential diagnosis is bilateral 6-nerve palsy, wherein we differentiate by esotropia, which is more for distance, then presence of near, it is better, and then the secondly divergence palsy and divergence insufficiency. These are the close differential diagnosis. Treatment, conservative treatment, we given trial of full correction of refractive error, treatment of amblyopia, of if any. Botox is nowadays coming up as a good option in these cases, but even surgery gives a good realignment and carries a good prognosis for re-establishing fusion, and one should not delay the surgery unnecessarily. And Now, role of Botox versus surgery. Injection botulinum gives good results, especially in younger age group. Children have found to require lesser injections. They're found in studies that 1 to 3 injections may be needed. Surgery gives good result, and one has to be careful and against undercorrection. I prefer to use adjustable sutures in such cases. I just briefly discuss 2 cases. The 16-year-old female came with double vision headache since 4 months prior to seeing us. There was no significant history in recent past. She was a myope using specs since 5 years. The best corrected visual acuity was 6/6 with minus 3.25 and 3, and pupil and fundus were normal. The orthoptic, there was a right esotropia, and prism bar cover test showed 25 to 30 prism diopter for distance near and in the gazes. No abduction deficit in the ocular movements. So Hess chart also showed near symmetrical displacement of the eye inward, and MRI was normal. So this I felt was an acute concomitant esotropia query type 2. So the procedure she underwent after reassessment was right eye RN, medial rectus resection 4.45 millimeter on adjustable with lateral rectus resection of 5 millimeters. This is a Hess chart showing an symmetrical inward displacement, and she had a small angle, not a very, and these are the post-op result after doing an RNR procedure with adjustable suture, and these are the findings. And she remains under follow-up and is maintaining her orthophoric state. Now, this is a surgical video of adjustable suture, but I think I'll skip this. I'll just take the last case. This was a 27-year-old male who complained of double vision since 6 months. There was no significant past history. The visual acuity was 6/9 with -6 in both the eyes. He had some stress in the recent past and the death in his family. And rest everything was normal. MRI was normal. He had a larger angle, right esotropia again with 45 prism diopters of esotropia for distance and near. It was just grade 1 abduction deficit, and so probably he was addicted to his cell phone and used to be on the cell phone late till night. Before he developed this. So the procedure done was right medial rectus recession 5 millimeters on adjustable and right lateral rectus plication 7.5 millimeters. This is this video just before doing the adjustment. You need an adjustment, but as you can see, only for post-op day, the eyes are always straight. And this is the video where he was maintaining an orthophoria and a good binocular. So thanks for a patient listening.
Thank you, Shubhangi madam. Actually, following the use of mobile phones due to pandemic has actually resulted in not only myopia, but few cases are coming with sudden onset esotropias also. So I think that was a very interesting case which you presented. So with this, I would like to introduce our next speaker. He is one of my close friends, Dr. Uday Naik. He is a postgraduate from Shri Ganpati Netralaya, Jalna, and a fellowship from Shankar Netralaya, Chennai. He has also done a fellowship in Storm Eye Institute, Charleston, United States. He has been a consultant at Shri Ganpati Netralaya and at Choitram Netralaya, Indore. He's a faculty in many state and national conferences and has presented papers and instruction course in pediatric ophthalmology. Presently, he is working at Navtej Netralaya, super specialty eye care at Nanded. With this, I'd invite Dr. Uday Naik for his talk, please.
Thank you, Rushikesh, for the introduction. till the time I share my screen, I would like to thank MOS organizing committee for giving me this opportunity to present over here. One thing about IDS, I want to mention that for Corona, 2 waves came, but after that, lot many waves and tsunami came of webinars, and through those webinars, I arrived at a conclusion that anything and everything said about IDS is not wrong. But still, I would like to, shall I begin? Hello,
Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes,
yes.
Sudhir. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's visible. You can start.
Okay. Still, I would like to talk on approach to intermittent divergent squint. As we all know that IDS is the most common squint entity which presents to us, and it is exodeviation which is intermittently controlled by fusional mechanisms. Usually the patients are asymptomatic, but the more vocal are the parents or peers who bring the patients to you. They complain of crossed eyes when the patient is either daydreaming or tired or sick. Few patients can come with asthenopia. Very rarely they come with transient diplopia. So depending on the presentation, the clinic phases of the squint clinical presentation varies. Most patient with phoria, mostly they are asymptomatic. The patient who are having IDS for distance, they may be symptomatic for distance. Patients who are having exotropia for distance, but either phoria or IDS for near, they have normal binocular vision for near, but suppression for distance. And when there is exotropia for distance as well as near, they completely lack binocularity. So in clinical evaluation, history taking is very important. Parents have to be made a partner in the management. We should involve them in decision making, and we should proactively tell them or demonstrate them that IDS is not a uniocular phenomena, it is a binocular condition. And in history taking, specific inquiry has to be done about frequency of the deviation or squinting, duration of the squinting, and in cases of children, you have to ask whether the child closes his or her eye in the bright light. As in all strabismus cases, sensory evaluation has to be done even before visual acuity estimation. So usually we lack in private practices, we lack stereo acuity tests for distance, but at least for stereopsis for near should be tested on each and every visit. Accurate refraction has to be done, followed by orthoptic evaluation and ocular motility evaluation. So it is always a legacy and what I should say, luxury to have such a long 20 feet long examination room, but it helps it really helps in measuring IDS. We have to measure deviations in all the 9 gauges for near, for distance, as well as for very far distance. 86% of patients who undergo surgery for largest angle, they have satisfactory alignment compared to 62% operated for standard distance, means 6 meter. So Kushner has even suggested that you make the patient to see outside the window or door, maybe for 1/4 mile, and then check your this deviation. One thing I would like to tell is that while measuring deviation, never ever allow the patient to see with both the eyes. Then measure near point of convergence. It is relevant in small angles, and if there is distant and near disparity in the angles, do occlusion test for at least 1 hour or +3 diopter lens test. So after doing measurement, we should arrive at a classification of IDS or a type of IDS, whether it is basic, whether it is divergence excess or convergence insufficiency type, or whether it is pseudo divergence excess type. Then look for extraocular motility, and if there is any pattern, because we all know V pattern is very common in IDS patients with inferior oblique overactions. Also A pattern is common with superior oblique overactions. So what is most important to obtain a baseline evaluation, to monitor deterioration and to monitor progression of intermittent exotropia. So here is the answer which I got. So there are many methods which are given for assessing the control. But what I personally feel is that a surgeon should adopt to a particular method. He should stick to it, and the method should be comfortable, and the surgeon should be consistent with it. So maybe what method I adopt may be different from others. So here is a one clinical control score method in which the IDS is scored on a scale of 0 to 5, where 5 is the worst control. So here what we have to do is we have to observe the patient for 30 seconds without doing any dissociation. And in this 30 seconds, if there is constant exotropia, then the score will be 5. If there is exotropia for more than 50% of time, score will be 4. And if it is less than 50% of time, it will be score 3. So what I have found that this 5, 4, 3, they coincide with poor control. Now, after 30 seconds, we are supposed to do a cover test, and the squint will be manifested. And what we have to see is how soon the squint recovers. So if it is recovering after 5 seconds, the score will be 2. If within 1 to 5 seconds, the score will be 1. And if less than 1 second or immediate, it will be 0. So this 2 and 1 score corresponds with the fair control, and 0 corresponds with the good control. So here is the patient without doing anything, the squint is manifested. So definitely this is a poor control. In this child is taking a blink, and then the squint is getting recovered. So this is a fair control. Always give accommodative targets. Here, even after many rapid cover tests, the squint is getting manifested later, and on removal of the cover, the squint is getting corrected immediately. So this is a good control. So next, one more method followed is Newcastle score method, where they incorporate data from clinic and home, and they add up all the three, like the home data, then clinic data for near and distance, and they add up if the score is 9, then it's a worst control. So what I personally do is I ask the parents, and if they say that the squint manifests rarely, and that too only at distance when fatigued, then I consider it as an excellent control at home. If manifesting less than 5 times only for distance, it's a good control. If manifesting more than 5 times at distance but aligned at near, it's a fair control. And if it is breaking frequently, it's a poor control. We can on stereo acuity estimation, if you are getting that binocularity is decreased, again it's a poor control. And we all know that natural history is yet to be fully elucidated. So in management, there is non-surgical and surgical, but again, there is lack of clarity regarding criteria for intervention and optimal intervention. Non-surgical interventions are not much effective, but you can try it before as a method to buy times before proceeding for surgery. It usually can be helpful in less than 20 angles and with high AC by A ratio. PDGAI is yet to come out with its final results regarding use of or minus therapies. There is insufficient evidence to recommend patching as a therapy, and prisms are not used most commonly. So indications for surgery are poor control, which is established by history and examination, presence of squint for more than 50% of waking hours, deteriorating stereo acuity, increasing size of deviation, osmosis, diplopia, and suppression. All these are indications for surgery. Again, regarding timing, there are no consistent guidelines. But what literature says is that better sensory outcomes are achieved if the child is treated before 7 years of age or before 5-year duration of the squint itself. And if you find rapid loss of control noted, you can operate even before 4 years. Bilateral lateral rectus recession works well for all types except for convergent insufficiency, where we do bimedial rectus resection. But in literature, there is no difference found in BLR versus R&R. Importantly,
Uday,
yeah,
please
this is the last one. Sorry for delay, but we can aim slight overcorrection for visually mature children, but for immature children and patient developing IDS after 10, we have to target orthotropia, and for long-standing IDS in adults, slight undercorrection. Target the largest deviation, but remember that even after good surgery, 1 in 5 have second surgery, may need second surgery. So these are some patients. Thank you very much. Thank you for delay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Uday. Actually, it's a very extensive topic, IDS. So 8 minutes obviously may not be enough. So thanks for a wonderful talk. I think I will invite the next speaker. We might run with short of time. The next speaker is Dr. Snehal Thakre. She is a professor in ophthalmology at MGM Medical College, Aurangabad. She has done a fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology from the prestigious LV Prasad Eye Institute, and also done an online course in managing myopia through Brian Holden Vision Institute in Sydney. She has presented many papers and posters in various national and international conferences, and also has publications in various peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed journals. With this, I will invite Dr. Snehal Thakre for an interesting talk on abnormal ocular movements. Dr. Snehal, please.
1 minute. काय झालंय ते? Just a second. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Is my screen? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction. Today, I will be talking about abnormal ocular movements. Think about beyond the eye, or maybe think unusual. So when we talk about abnormal eye movements, we think first thing comes to mind nystagmus or concomitant strabismus, which may be paralytic or restrictive. But sometimes there are patients like this young boy who is trying to move his both eyes, but they just don't seem to be moving. Or the child in the image on the right hand side whose eyes are moving in all the directions, but the movements are definitely not free and full in all directions of gaze. So what do we do now? It's best to take a step back, approach the patient again, take the history again, repeat the examination. History should be directed to towards the ocular complaints and details of diplopia, any anomalous head posture, diurnal variation, very important, and associated drooping of the lids. Neurological complaints also should be positively looked for, like difficulty in walking, balancing, any palpitations, tremors, history of any diagnosed neurological disorder now or in the past, or any relieving or aggravating factors. The evaluation of the ocular movements should be done properly, not missing out any of these vergens, ductions, vergences, saccades and pursuits, torsions, and FDTs and FGTs wherever indicated. A complete ocular examination will point toward the diagnosis, and maybe we should look for whether there is any proptosis, ptosis, cataracts, retinal degenerations, etc. Keeping these things in mind, I'll be discussing 4 cases. The first case is of a 16-year-old boy who came with a history of drooping of both the lids in the last 6 years, which was gradually increasing, and there were no other ocular complaints. He also complained of difficulty in getting up to sitting and standing position, inability to lift hands, difficulty in grasping, swallowing. There was no history of variability in either the ocular or the systemic complaints. I'll be just sticking to the positive findings on examination. His power was reduced bilaterally in both the eyes. Vision was near normal with the glasses. Then he had a severe ptosis in the right eye and a moderate ptosis in the left eye. The right eye showed a 15-degree Hirschberg's test. Cover-uncover test could not be done as no refixation movements were possible. Versions and ductions were severely limited. Convergence was absent in this child. There was a weak orbicularis. As you can see, you can easily open the eyes, and an absent Bell's phenomenon. Keeping all these things in mind, we did an ISPAC test, which is negative. The fundus examination was normal. And we kept a differential diagnosis of chronic progressive external ophthalmoplegia, congenital fibrosis of extraocular muscles, and ocular myasthenia gravis. CF-EOMS was ruled out because there was no history. This was since 6 years only, and he was 16 years old. There was no family history of similar complaints. Ocular myasthenia gravis also was ruled out because the ISPAC test was negative. There was no history of variability, and no other myasthenia-specific signs were seen. So keeping CPO in mind, the patient was referred back to the pediatrician, and we did the lab investigations, which came out positive for myopathy. Keeping the myopathy, we did a muscle biopsy, and which showed the presence of ragged fibers, and which is strongly suggestive of a mitochondrial myopathy. Now, many mitochondrial disorders affect the eye, of which our patient classically fit into the category of CPEO with the presence of ophthalmoplegia, ataxia, short stature, lactic acidosis, and ragged red fibers on the muscle biopsy. So we made a clinical diagnosis of CPO and advised a confirmatory investigation of mitochondrial DNA analysis, but the patient did not refuse to do the same. He was sent back on symptomatic treatment with coenzyme Q and Benagilis and other to improve the mitochondrial functioning. The second case was again of drooping of eyelids, but this was only since 8 days and associated with high-grade fever. There was no history of variability, no other ocular systemic complaints in this 9-year-old boy. Systemic examination was normal. He had a normal head posture, but he had a mild to moderate ptosis in both the eyes. His ocular movements were limited, as you can see, but he was orthophoric in primary position. IcePac test was done, though there was no history of variability, we did it. And because we do it in all patients of ptosis, basically. So you can see the improvement in the ptosis after the IcePac test. But the limitations remained the same. So, but still keeping myasthenia in mind, I thought about doing an edrophonium or a neostigmine test, which was not available. We did an acetylcholine receptor antibodies, which were negative. But what 30 to 70% of the pediatric population is seronegative for myasthenia gravis antibodies. So the next test which should have been done was the single fiber EMG to confirm MG, but again, this was unavailable. But recent literature shows that the IcePac test and the single fiber EMG have similar diagnostic accuracy with ocular myasthenia presenting with ptosis. So we made a clinical diagnosis of ocular myasthenia gravis, and we started the patient on pyridostigmine 20 milligram QID. He responded very well to the pyridostigmine, and you can see that his ocular movements are full and free now, and there is absolutely no ptosis. He actually went on to develop some dermatological association of the myasthenia gravis, which is called as pityriasis rubra. So we tip at the end of these two cases would be suspect myopathy or neuromuscular cause when ophthalmoplegia does not fit any particular pattern, associated weakness of other muscle groups, and diagonal variation. Coming to the last two cases, I'll go quickly through them. 23-year-old female with complaints of diplopia on looking towards the left. She was admitted for postpartum PIH. And if you see, she had definite limitation of adduction in the right eye. And there is an nystagmus which was present in the abducting eye, and convergence was present. Taking all the classical features, we made a diagnosis of internuclear ophthalmoplegia, right-sided. Patient was basically controlled with treatment of BP, but patient was lost to follow-up, and her MRI showed an infarction in the pons. Lastly, a 4-year-old boy with outward deviation of the left eye. No other ocular complaints. Parents did not notice anything else. It was a known case of tuberculoma of the right frontal lobe at the age of 18 months. Vision was less, but this was, you can see, he had a compound hypermetropic astigmatism and a left hypotropia with a left exotropia. And if you see his ocular movements, there is definite limitation of the upgaze. Now, keeping all his clinical history and examination in mind, we came to a diagnosis of upgaze palsy with left eye exotropia, with left hypotropia, with both eyes meridional amblyopia. And this was status post neurotuberculosis of the right thalamus. So remember to keep nuclear, internuclear, supranuclear disorders when the gaze is involved, nystagmus is present, and history of neurological disease past or present. To summarize, I would say that abnormal ocular movements may involve both eyes not moving together, which we see more commonly, both eyes moving together but not completely. Take a good history, past and present. Neurological history is very important. History of variability should not be missed because myasthenia is a great mimic. As a matter of fact, myasthenia can mimic any of the cases, any of the 3 cases which I showed today. IcePac test is simple, cheap, and reliable. And do not miss the nystagmus. Lastly, pay attention to the details in ocular examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snehal. Actually, it was a very nice presentation and very interesting cases. I mean, they are like a bit offbeat statistics and a lot of neuro-ophthalmological cases involved in that. So I think it was, I mean, very interesting cases which you had presented. And unfortunately, few of your, I mean, 1 or 2 patients had lost to follow-up. Otherwise, it would have been far more interesting to know
They
what.
were all actually at the time of this COVID began. So then we couldn't follow them up. So though we called the myasthenia patient and he came back.
With this, I would like to welcome Dr. Abha Kanade, madam, for her presentation. Dr. Abha is the first to receive Strabismological Society's Travel Fellowship award in 1994. She has been an executive committee member of Strabismus Society of India, which is now SPOCI, and organizing secretary of Strabicon in 2004. She was a treasurer of Pune Ophthalmological Society, and she has been a faculty in various state and national conferences, and also a registered faculty for Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society. With this, I would invite Dr. Abha for her talk, please.
Is my screen visible? Screen visible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to thank Dr. Ragini Madam, MOS, and Chairman Scientific Committee, Dr. Hemalini Samant, and Dr. Snehal Thakre for giving me this opportunity to speak on the subject. The incidence of Brown syndrome is very less. Means 1 in 450 cases of strabismus, you will find 1 Brown syndrome cases. Brown was first to describe this structural anomaly. It comes under the musculofacial innervational anomalies. With this entity, the amount of deviation doesn't correspond with the limitation of movement. You can see here that the deviation is not there in the primary position, but there is a large limitation of movement in of elevation in adduction. The same way you can find in this also that there is hardly any deviation in the primary position, but absence of elevation in adduction with the hypertropia is there. The clinical features is the same: elevation of absence of elevation in adduction. There is unaffected elevation in primary and abducted position. Action of the superior oblique may be normal or overaction, and usually you will find positive post-action test. There are 3 main types. One is the mild, where you will see that limitation of elevation is present only in adduction. In the moderate variety, you will find limitation of adduction, limitation of elevation in adduction with the hypertropia in adduction. And in the severe type, all these 2 features are there, and you will find deviation in the primary position in the form of hypertropia. It is also known as Brown's plus. The main thing is that the complex machinery consisting of muscle, trochlea, tendon, which is especially vulnerable to a variety of developmental and acquired defects. In the congenital, there may be anomalies of the tendon, trochlea sheath, superior oblique muscles, or anomalies of the inferior oblique and adjacent structures. In the acquired, you'll find inflammatory, traumatic, iatrogenic, and miscellaneous causes in the form of pontine hemorrhage and metastasis from the carcinoma. Very rarely you will find that there is a slippage of the lateral rectus below the globe that prevents the elevation in adduction. So in this type of patients, the MRI is essential. In our patients, improvement after tenotomy, so LR, so there was no involvement of the LR. It was not the cause. The treatment is conservative and in surgical intervention. The conservative treatment, when because the spontaneous resolution is possible, I will show in my cases. Steroid injection at the site of the trochlea, especially in cases of congenital pediatric arthritis patients, and duction exercises. Surgical intervention when there is a deviation in the primary position and significant abnormal head posture. You need to see these patients and do the surgery. In this patient, which I showed, deviation in adduction. So this patient was asked for the follow-up. I just gave her adduction exercises, and you can see that her deviation improved. You can see the elevation has improved in adduction. I just called her 1 year back again, and this deviation is not there. She is a patient of, she's high hypermetro patient. There was a ESO deviation and the left eye was unchecked. I just wanted to record the movements, and accidentally I found that there is a Brown syndrome. Means there was a elevation in adduction. Since the patient was high hypermetropic, so I gave her glasses and asked for the follow-up. The otherwise I was astrolepic, and you can see that, believe me, she is the same patient. She regularly comes for follow-up, and you can see that there is definitely improvement of elevation. This is a patient of Brown's plus. Here you can see that there is a hypotropia in the primary gaze, and there is hypotropia, and you can see that absence of elevation. This patient is very good candidate for the surgery, but patient didn't came for the surgery. So what are the surgical options? You can do a stripping of the superior oblique. You can do tenotomy, tendinectomy, Z-plasty of the superior oblique, depending on the amount of deviation, weakening or recession of the superior oblique at insertion, lengthening of the superior oblique using the 240 retinal band. But nowadays it is not mainly done because of lot of adhesions can occur. Mobart's suggested trochlear luxation, but not that. These are various diagrammatic representation of the various surgical procedures. I will not go into the details. This was a patient that had a limitation of elevation, and she had an abnormal head posture as well. So this patient was operated for. We did superior oblique tenotomy, and she improved, but there was overaction of the inferior oblique muscle. But since the patient used to come for the regular op and there was no deviation in the primary position, so we didn't do anything. But as she grew, she was very much bothered about her inferior oblique overaction. Means, so we operated for the inferior oblique. The inferior oblique weakening procedure was done. Yeah. So just, yeah. The patient of this patient had a convergent lesion, so and with the Browns. So as we were about to operate on the medial rectus, and we did the superior to the superior rectus insertion, and the patient improved. This patient came after a long time for follow-up, and very little inferior oblique overaction, but I don't think there is any need to do the surgery for that. So in conclusion, wait and watch. If there is no significant anomalous head posture, ask parents if they want to postpone the surgery, not to correct the head posture. Choose appropriate surgery. Long-term follow-up is essential. Inform your pediatrician and orthopedic colleagues that any patient with abnormal head posture, take ophthalmologist's opinion, because one patient received heavy doses of steroids, oral steroids for the abnormal head posture. One patient, in view of the abnormal head posture, was advised neck muscle surgery. So all these things are there, and it is my commitment that I always keep one slide for the nature, save nature. It is a concept of virtual water, that is hidden water, by Tony Allen in 1993. 1 cup of coffee requires 140 liters of water. 1 liter milk requires 1000 liters of water, and 1 kg wheat requires 1,350 liters of water. 1 kg rice requires 3,000 liters of water. This is by the Mr. Atul Devgaonkar book Vishwase Arth. So we should respect water as well. Thank you. Thank you for patient listening, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, madam, for a wonderful talk on Brown syndrome. We are reaching the last presentation of today's session by Dr. Vaishali Une. Dr. Vaishali is a associate professor at Government Medical College, Dhule. She has done fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology from Arvinda Institute, Coimbatore, and AIIMS, Delhi. She has presented at WCPOS at Milan, Hyderabad, and APACRS at Kuala Lumpur and APOS, Jaipur. She has been invited as a guest lecturer at Orlando, Florida. She has multiple international publications, especially in JAPOS. Presently, she is, I think, she is the president of Aurangabad. She was the president of the Aurangabad Ophthalmological Society. I'll invite Dr. Vaishali for her talk on Duane syndrome.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was
Yes.
Muted. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rishikesh and Dr. Snehal and Ragini ma'am for giving me this opportunity. And it's an honor to present here amongst the stalwarts. So I'll now present my topic on management of Duane's retraction syndrome. So Duane's is a defective horizontal eye movements with palpebral fissure narrowing on adduction and widening on abduction. It is often referred to as Stilling-Turk-Duane syndrome because first in 1887, it was Stilling who first presented about this syndrome, and it was later popularized by Duane and Turk. So it is more commonly in females, about 60% of females. Unilateral cases are about 80%, and which involves the left eye. And genetics plays a role about sporadic. It is commonly seen in sporadic cases. There is the mutation in CHN1 gene. So my topic is about the management of Duane's retraction syndrome. So why do we need to manage the syndrome? The first and primary thing is about the altered head posture. So if you see carefully, that this is the face turn towards the right. And then there is limitation of abduction in the Duane syndrome. There are various types, we'll come to that. And then there is gross retraction of the globe. So these are the three things. And for this, we need to, these can be the indications for the surgery as well. So altered head posture, then the retraction of the globe, and limitations in adductions and abductions. So quick small video on how the various things we see in the Duane syndrome. So obviously this is ortho-Duane's, but yes, we can see the abduction limitation in the right eye, and then you can see the upshoot, and the IPF is narrowed so much. So these are the classical findings which we see usually in a Duane syndrome. So etopathogenesis is paradoxical. Most important is the paradoxical innervation to the horizontal recti, and the left eye preponderance is seen in 75%, whereas the bilateral cases are around 20%. So now it is a part of the CCDD, that is a congenital cranial disinnervation disorder, and it comes under restrictive pathology. It can be congenital acquired. Acquired can be of post-traumatic dysthyroid orbitomyopathy, or even in cases of cysticercosis, we can get this syndrome. So commonest is the type 1, where we have only abduction limited, and adduction is normal. There can be esotropia. So there are another variants are ESO-DRS, EXO-DRS, and ortho-DRS. So there is globe retraction, as we have seen earlier in the video, and the interpalpebral fissure narrowing on adduction and widening on the abduction. Type 2 is less common than the type 1. It can be associated with the exotropia, and abduction may be normal or limited and associated with globe retraction and narrowing of the interpalpebral fissure. Type 3 DRS, there is both abduction limitation as well as adduction limitation associated with the two other findings, that is globe retractions and IPF narrowing. The upshoots or the downshoots, which we saw in the video, was that is due to the co-contraction of the horizontal recti and the slippage of the globe under the tight lateral rectus while movements. So it does not follow the Sherrington's law, and the comfort we can confirm it by the post-duction test, where there will be so it is very important that we do a post-duction test in most of the cases of the restrictive strapus muscle. Differential diagnosis, primarily it can be lateral rectus palsy, then infantile esotropia with cross fixation. Also, we can get confused with it. But again, it will not be associated with the globe retraction and the decreased interpalpebral fissures. Then recovered third nerve palsy may mimic Duane's, so we have to rule out about that also. And when there is medial rectus entrapment after a fracture, medial wall fracture, that can also cause retraction of the globe. So the coming to the surgeries, so like in the previous slide I showed that altered head posture in cases of orthoduanes, then whether it is associated with esotropia, associated with exotropia, and marked globe retraction. Is there any medical management? In very mild cases and very small deviation, then only prisms can be helpful. And the surgeries can be for the, again, it can be differentiated into mild, moderate, the ESO or exoduans. So most of the times we do the medial rectus recessions, either if it is a mild case, we can go for unilateral. And if it is bilateral, then we can go for medial rectus, and depending on the if there is the exoduans angle is more, then we can go for both medial and lateral recessions, and the other ipsilateral as well as the contralateral recessions of the medial rectus. Y split of the lateral rectus for the upshoots are most of them prefer the posterior fixation of the lateral rectus, and vertical recti transposition is now mostly commonly preferred when with or without medial rectus recessions. So just think that how the Y splits helps. The Y split is done almost 20 to 22 millimeters. The lateral rectus is split, and in between a difference of 20 millimeters is kept. And again, it can also be recessed by 6 to 7 millimeters, and it gives excellent results in these kinds of upshoots. So the vertical recti transpositions are the superior rectus are commonly used, and they are transposed either we can do a partial recti to the lateral rectus suturing, or sometimes even we can go for the medial rectus. To summarize, in unilateral ESO-DRS, we need to go for the medial rectus recessions, unilateral, or we can do asymmetric recessions in both the muscles. And then if angle is small, we can go for just a single muscle. Large angles, ipsilateral as well as medial and lateral recessions and needed. Upshoots and downshoots can be managed by the bisplitting of the lateral rectus. Severe abduction deficiencies can be managed by vertical recti transposition or superior recti transposition, especially so. And role of adjustable sutures is also there, though personally I haven't tried in any of my DRS case. So thank you all for a patient hearing, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you again.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Vaishali, ma'am. Actually, you have to individualize every case of Duane syndrome, but thank you for a wonderful presentation. Actually, we are running short of time. Actually, we have exceeded the time. So with this, I think we will need to conclude the session so that we can.
Yes, that was the mainstay, that each DRS needs to be customized. So that is the mainstay that go according to case. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rishikesh.
I'll hand over to Dr. Parikshit, sir.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone, and
Thank you,
happy
sir.
Diwali in advance. Stay home, stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank
Nice
you.
cases, nice talks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.